I guess I'll start. I'm Tom Boak, the chairman of the Kennebunkport Planning Board. I have 4 members here: George Lichty, my vice chair, Nina, and Larry Simmons. Now, this is a joint workshop with the Conservation Commission, so you guys should introduce yourselves, please.
I'm Steve Hanna.
Carol Morris. Karen Hall. Robin Phillips.
Okay. What we we're continually in planning board, our purpose is, among other things, to approve stuff happening in shoreland and resource protection zones. And what inevitably comes up is we ask people to be nice to the wetlands and not put a lot of fertilizer and pesticides. And we're trying to understand what you guys are doing and how it might impact us in the future. And beyond that, I want to hear about what you're doing. So if you can tell us about your new what you're doing.
Well, you can interrupt me when I get it wrong. So, we, as you probably know, we did a survey to get a sense of what the public was thinking right now, because obviously any new ordinance needs to be voted on. So we wanted to get a sense of what people wanted, and essentially there was very strong level of concern with just townwide with the use of pesticides and fertilizers, synthetic fertilizers. So we also heard a very strong support for education about it. There was a significant amount of interest in banning them from a certain segment of the population. There was also a certain lack of interest in banning them from a percent of the population. So, but there was a strong interest in education and a strong concern. So what we have on the books, what we have proposed right now is essentially a first step, which would be to ask any commercial firm who is putting pesticides or synthetic fertilizers on pesticides that have synthetics in them to register in the town in January of the year and to log report out at the end of the year how much and where they have put them on. And we figured that will give us a baseline of what's happening. And we will at the same time work to roll out an aggressive education campaign, because I think there's a lot of interest in town in using organics. And I think, and the committee thinks that we could shift a lot of people to use organics without having to make it a law. So that would be our first step. And asking the applicators to report will give us an idea that how much is actually going on. And it would take a while, of course, to log through multiple years and see if it was making a difference, but at least it gives us something that's not anecdotal. So that's where we are with it right now. Do you want to add anything to that, Steve?
Well, about the report, people are saying, okay, supposing somebody sends you all these data, all the different companies, and you get all these numbers, and what are you going to do with that? And how is it going to come in? And so what we're proposing is that we'll just have a standard format like Excel spreadsheet that we make available to them, and then they fill it on a weekly basis on the amounts and types of pesticides and so on, and then submit it to us, and then we will analyze the data and add it up and so on and so forth. So we're not trying to go through a town website, because it takes a long time to get that working and so on and so forth. So we think we can do it this way at least, and for the first year, we'll see how it works out.
Can I say something there? Okay. I'm the one who's persona non grata on the committee, on the planning board sometimes with some of our applicants, because I feel very strongly about bird strikes, and I feel very strongly about using pesticides, especially near waterways and water bodies. I've worked with farmers in the past as part of my doctorate program in weed science and helping farmers apply pesticides. So, you know, I'm not organic or anything. I believe in using some of them, but I believe there are, you know, ways to mitigate, and there are places where you don't use them, or like homeowners tend to throw too much on and don't know what they're doing. So I think an educational program is a really great idea. The data that you're talking about accumulating would be very helpful to the planning board, because we've had some controversy about just how much can we regulate developers, people who are building homes, and the amount of fertilizer they can put on near the shoreland zoning and things like that. So I think we could help each other that way, and that it could help us plan. As I understand it from Lori, from her email, you're working towards an ordinance that people can vote on, basically. And this would not affect the land use ordinance, but it's something that we could use perhaps to propose some changes to the land use ordinance. That's why this meeting is really in effect. So we could go through some of that.
Okay,
I just wanted to add, this project has been, they're doing this in Falmouth, I believe, for 6 years, and they gave us a report, met with us, was very helpful, because when you see tonnage of chemicals used, it kind of gives you a, so if any of you would like to look at that, we have that, right? We could send you that. It's very comprehensive, the way they put it together, what they measured, and just as an example, Steve kind of, you know, based some of that off Falmouth, right?
Yeah,
Because, you know,
that would be very helpful.
yeah, it was really
yeah.
good.
For us, some of our members have tried to bring in ordinances from other states or from Maine recommendations, and I don't have the basis for that to say this, it's going to be this specific. So having some data that we could look at perhaps to make some requirements basically in resource protection zone and the shoreland zone. But you should keep in mind that the planning board doesn't really have authority to regulate this on all properties. Warner is the one who looks at properties that are not in shoreline or resource protection or non-conforming, or conforming, basically. So, and he doesn't have anything that he could use to restrict people in their use of pesticides or fertilizer or anything like that. I also wanted to mention that I've been looking at your website on the town website, and I want to compliment you on the best practices information that you put out for people, lawns for lobsters and so forth. I think it's very nice and it's very well written. So,
yeah. Did you have any comments? Okay, you mentioned about the, you know, shoreland zone and areas and so on, and this reporting component of it. You know, we discussed how to break it down into different areas of the town. And we initially were saying, well, maybe shoreland and non-shoreland, but then we looked at the maps, and the shoreland is so irregular and strange, it's hard to split it up. So we ended up going and asking the applicators to break it down by 5 different areas according to the map. You know, basically the Goose Rocks Beach area, the Cape Porpoise areas, the village residential, there's about 5 different ones there. And then the free enterprise zone and the farm and forest zone. So the breakdown will also go, we'd be reported that way.
Will you have addresses so that you can determine the water body components of certain areas within those zones? I
Well,
mean,
that
you've got
came
vernal
up-
pools and streams and things like that. It gets complicated.
We were getting some
There was a lot of, this has been closely followed by a number of applicators, mainly Grass being one, of course, and they have attended most of our meetings and been quite concerned that we were going to curtail their activities. So they were extremely concerned about having to log, report addresses. And we got feedback from people that even regardless, that would be an invasion of privacy and et cetera, that people don't want to have that out in public. So in the interest of doing something as uncontroversial as possible to start, we didn't ask for addresses. We're just asking for locations based on that.
I was at the last Board of Selectmen meeting, and at least, I think, 3 applicators called in on that to make their comments about that.
About that, yeah,
Oh.
they feel very strongly about that. So, and I can see there are people, individual citizens, I'm sure, who would feel the same way. So we felt that
Yeah.
it was not I won't say it wouldn't be valuable, but it wouldn't be
Right.
required.
I think it's a really noble cause, and I have a lot of questions. And I'll list some of them out generally, and personally, I'm supportive. I think the definitions are very difficult, and I think the enforcement is got a lot of problems. Code enforcement, I think it's a pretty busy office. At least when I go in there, they look pretty busy, and landscapers, I'll just throw that out there, landscapers, applicators, especially this time of year, they work really long hours. They work really late. They work a lot of weekends. They're understaffed. I can't imagine without any kind of regulatory body that they're going to voluntarily start filling out some additional paperwork. And doesn't mean that they shouldn't or that they can't, but I think it's going to be really hard to get that going without any sort of enforcement. I wonder how you've addressed that. Another thing generally, what we say pesticides and fertilizer, I hope we're including, as you mentioned, herbicides in that. All sorts of different chemicals that are applied. And the notion that organic solves the problem. If you put a lot of organic nitrogen like blood meal down around a body of water, you're still going to get eutrophication of those bodies of water because you're dumping a bunch of nitrogen into it. Doesn't matter whether it's synthetic or organic. So I think the education thing is an amazing place to start and a good place to start. But and from the planning board perspective, what the planning board does is, as I've said before, we don't plan anything. What we do is when things are getting developed that are outside the round or a subdivision, they come before the board and then we say, is it meeting the requirements of the ordinances? So without any kind of ordinance, we can suggest things. I'm fascinated to find out what Falmouth is doing and what other communities are doing, or if the state planning office has guidelines as we all approach this issue. So I'll just throw all that crap out there and then be quiet.
Well, let me respond to your comment about landscapers being busy and not having time to do this. They all do, all licensed people with licenses are required to report to the state annually. So this is something that they already do. And we had, in addition to having Palmer Higgins, who's the main head of Mainly Grass, at our meetings, I corresponded with him afterwards and asked him to give me more detail on how they do their reporting to the state. So we tried to get, it's not exactly the same as reporting to the state, and I'm expecting there may be a bit of adjustment as we move through this process, because we did want a little bit more information. But they already are set up to do that.
Okay.
And it's not like they have to report every time they do it. It's reporting, well, right now we have it reporting monthly. So, we'll see how that looks. But, wait, let me be clear. They have to report it, is it weekly or monthly?
Weekly.
Sorry. They have to report it by week, so they'll have to log it, but they don't have to give it to us weekly. It's an annual report that has to come in at I think, in the month of January. And I apologize for not knowing about it as much, but we've gone through a number of permutations,
Great.
so.
How was Falmouth doing it?
You looked at that, right, Steve?
Well, I couldn't tell you the details of it. I'd have to look at it again. Do you remember?
I don't.
Or are they getting local information, or are they getting information from the state and
They're
breaking
getting
it down?
they're getting it locally.
Locally, okay.
Right.
Yep.
Voluntarily as well. I mean, they have, what did she say, 3 golf courses in Falmouth? So it was a struggle. And still, after 6 years, they do not technically have an ordinance, but they have had a lot of compliance. The woman that's head of that Conservation Commission, she worked with, everybody, and so it is voluntary.
They had the advantage, obviously, it's a bigger town, and by quite a bit, and they actually have a sustainability officer on staff. So they worked with that sustainability officer to do a lot of the legwork that we had to do as volunteers. So it was, it's been a bit challenging to get where we are even, but, and even so, as Robin said, they still don't have any kind of a ban to do it, but they also, there are a lot, we're able to set up and do a lot of education and reduce the amount that's put on. So,
I have spoken with several people who've spoken with their neighbors, and I know at least 4 people just from one neighbor have decided to give it up and try that out. So, it's one of those things where, let's try it, or, instead of, running right to the ordinance, because there was a lot of pushback. But let's see how we do just, with education. And when you see the amount of chemicals in Falmouth that are reported, it is, it's stunning. I thought, didn't you? It was tons.
Yeah.
It was in the tons of concentrate. That's what they report. So, quite a bit.
I'd like to respond to the comment you had about enforcement and how all that's going to be handled. And we did discuss that quite a bit. And one of the first things is they have to register. Okay, and so they'll be registering and sending it to us, I guess,
it'll be on the website.
on the website. But then, and there's going to be a fee. Yeah, so does the fee come to us or to Werner?
Yes, so they'll have to register, there'll be an online registration. The fee will not come to us, the fee will go to the town. What the town does with it is up to the town, and what the fee is, I think we're suggesting $250, is that right? But that's completely up for grabs, it can be smaller, it can be based on the size of the firm, all those details can be worked out. But is that?
Well, but then there's a question of supposing they don't pay the register and they're in town doing the stuff and not, how do we enforce that? And, that's a question. Maybe you would have some ideas about that. And the second thing is about the reporting, that supposing they don't report and they, just don't report, then what can we do about that? And we have talked about whether to get somebody like Werner involved and how that's going to work.
Well, if they're reporting to the state, can you get a list from the state and compare it to who's reporting in town?
Well, they report just general usage across all the state, not by town or even county or anything.
Mm-hmm.
So we can't get,
So you don't know who's really working in town?
you don't know who's working in the town. Many of them are working in multiple towns. Some of them, as you know, are like individual, one owner, just the owner does the thing and has some people they hire. Others are big companies that have offices in different states, in New Hampshire and everything. So it's a mixture of them.
Background. So we did meet with Lori and Werner about this and talked about enforcement. And I think the feeling is, we're not talking about the hundreds and hundreds of firms. You know, there might be a dozen. And I think it's going to be an informal situation where if one of us, let's say, driving around town or living in Goose Rocks Beach, where a lot of it goes on, sees a firm that is not registered, then we would probably speak to Werner. We talked about this. What the town would do would be call, say, did you know you're supposed to register? And, you know, ask them to register. And then if they didn't register, then perhaps a fine would be levied. But it's not, you know, going to be a punitive thing. If somebody, and the same thing, if somebody doesn't report, the firm doesn't report, remind them they need to report, and then, you know, if they continually don't report, then perhaps fine them. But it was not looking to be, you know, we're not putting people in the stocks or anything here. It's just
Were we allowed to ask Berner a question? Oh, you got a microphone. Excellent.
I even got a
Nice.
mic.
I thought you were just
Yep.
a silent observer. And I want to, here's a potential scenario. A lot of people start a landscaping company. They throw a couple of lawnmowers in the back of a pickup truck. They drive around, they mow some lawns. Someone wants some fertilizer applied. They do that. Maybe they've got one client in Kennebunkport, and they've got a bunch of people up to Rundle or Wells or whatever, but they got that one house they do. And now they've got to face a $250 fee for a customer. They might be making $100 out of a week. They may find that prohibitive. And I'm wondering, is there an analog? Is there another situation where people do something in Kennebunkport where they have to pay a fee? They're also registering with the state, they're registering with the town, and other than automobiles or something that's similar in the trades.
So I think the thing that comes to mind, you know, that we deal with on a regular basis is that the state a number of years ago set up a requirement for contractors that were doing work within the shoreland zone. So if you were doing earth moving activity, the state set up an educational program that went along with some licensing to it, to where contractors had to go through some classwork for erosion control, you know, best management practices in dealing with construction sites and so forth. If you were doing a project that is within the shoreland zone, so any kind, you know, these, you know, your larger, you know, your house construction, riprap, retainment walls, things like that. Many of the projects that you all have looked at, those contractors are required to be certified by the state of Maine in those erosion control practices. And so, but that starts at the state level, right? You know, so you've got a state level requirement, you know, that sets kind of a legal basis for that. They have a certification number, and, you know, towns, knowing that that's a requirement, so we have our forms set up such that, you know, you get a permit for the work, great, shoreland zone, yep, check the box, we know, all right, we need to see who's responsible for making sure that the erosion control is in place on that site. And so there's an individual's name, they have their license number, goes on the permit, so that if we wind up having an issue, you know, with that property, we know who's responsible for making sure that erosion control measures had to be in place. Now, it isn't always necessarily the folks doing the work. It can, you know, I don't want to say a third party, but, you know, you may have you might have you know, the supervisor might be the one with the certification, you know, and the fellows doing the work don't hold the cert, but supervisor might hold it for the company per se. But they're the ones then responsible for making sure that they're complying with these best management practices. So that's kind of, you know, I think that's the closest thing right now that's in place for, you know, that type of activity that would happen in a shoreland zone. But it started with some legislation, starts with the, you know, program that DEP manages, and then us as those who deal with shoreland zoning at the local level. I think technically the enforcement of it really falls back to DEP, but because we know it's an issue, we know it's a requirement. We've just adjusted our paperwork to make sure that folks know that yes, you need to be certified to do work in a shoreland zone. Okay. And we've had pretty good success with that in terms of compliance with contractors. It has, for those that hold the certification, it's, for towns that enforce it, it works well for those that have the certification because we don't issue the permit unless we've got somebody's name with that number and we can verify that if it's a company or a name that we don't know or recognize. So,
But currently, no one needs a permit to put fertilizer on their lawn in the spring.
well, one of the things that you're dealing with, and I think that's part of the struggle here, is that we're in a lot of ways we're dealing with a behavioral issue, right? So when it comes to dealing with a construction project, that's a much different animal. We've got activity that we see that happens over a longer period of time, and you're dealing with a behavioral issue that that shows up on a weekend. It shows up, it happens. I don't know how long it takes to put an application down, but it happens in half hour. These types of things, and so I think it's a bit of a different animal in terms of a tracking and an enforcement item. You also don't have like a local, kind of a local licensing requirement or something of that nature. When I hear discussion on fines and fees, even a code office doesn't necessarily just have the blanket authority to levy a fine or a fee. I mean, fees get set by the Board of Selectmen. They're the body that that sets the fees. I mean, we make recommendations to them, and they can agree with our recommendations or modify them or whatever they want to do. But even in terms of fines, by all accounts, fines are only, the courts have to assign a fine. It's not something we can just say, well, we're going to fine you. Well, then what? I mean, what if somebody doesn't pay? I mean, what carrot is there? You have a stick that you're attempting to use, but you've got no carrot to begin with. There's not a local license for somebody to do, that type of business. The town doesn't license, landscapers or something like that. But
I'm not a lawyer. Luckily, Nina is. I'm not very smart, and luckily, Nina is. But let's say, and you just pick one of them. You take fertilizer, and we charge someone $250 to register and record this fertilizer application in Kennebunkport. And then we take that $250 and we turn it into an education program to tell people not to use fertilizer. That's I'd be a little pissed if I'd be a little agitated if that was my job. And the gray area, the brown area, the area that I think that the board has been most concerned with is when we have projects that are in a protected area, up against a protected area, next to wetland, shoreland protection, really anywhere, but particularly on those marginal areas, we have been asking, as part of the approval process, and sometimes in the language saying, you will have a certain behavior when it comes to the glass you put in to protect from bird strikes and from applying chemicals of some sort around the property. And people nod and say, yes, that's terrific. We don't even know if we're allowed to do that. We've set the precedent of doing it, but we don't have anything to back that up. If someone wanted to go roar into court and say, look, I want to put down herbicides and I can do whatever I want to, maybe they can.
Well, that's not entirely true in the shoreline resource protection zones because
point.
we do have some language in 1010A that allows us to deny an application if we think it's going to be harmful to the water or the shoreline zoning. As far as the fee and how it's applied, there is no say to that any more than when you pay your taxes, you get to say how it's applied after you've got an elected official in there, okay? I'm
Good
pretty
point.
pissed about how my taxes are applied sometimes, but but I can't go to court and complain about it.
I'm pissed
or-
at how they apply your
or-
taxes,
Or
too.
withhold anything. So basically, an educational program is a legitimate use of those fees.
Okay.
And even if it works against the landscaper, it is still a legitimate use of those fees,
Good.
okay?
Thanks.
We were mainly directing it against the landscapers that use pesticides and herbicides. No, your example of the guy with a couple of lawnmowers, you know, they really aren't supposed to apply pesticides or herbicides unless they have gone through the official licensing procedures. So
That's right.
according
and-
to what Robin tells us, that the guys, there's a couple of lawnmowers, they aren't
Yeah.
really the ones who are applying herbicides and weed and feed
You
type
bet.
stuff.
And it takes a lot more time, and it's a lot more onerous to go through those programs than a $250 fee.
Yeah.
They'd probably rather pay $250 and not go through those programs.
Yeah.
And when have you last seen a landscaper with a couple of lawnmowers in the back of their truck? Okay,
Some,
Yeah, right.
A lot of them, though, they don't want to have to, there's so many applicators now that they don't want to deal with that. If you mow lawns, you don't want to be doing all that and then, having to have a license. So most of the ones I know that have been around a long time, they don't do any of that at all anymore.
they don't apply pesticides?
No.
No, they don't mow.
They
Don't
sub,
mow
they
lawns.
They don't mow.
subcontract, they
No, they mow.
subcontract it.
They say, go call Mainly Grass or go call whatever,
That's- They also make a lot more money applying those pesticides. I've hired landscapers to mow, and boy, do they come on, when they're pesticide applicated, boy, do they come on and try to sell you stuff.
Yeah.
So,
And that's part of, because we know people who do that and have dealt with these firms, we know that that's happening. And on the other hand, we also have heard through the survey from a lot of people who would prefer an organic option, but they're being told that an organic option won't work. So,
well, there's organic and there's organic,
Right, there's
and
different.
it's a very confusing thing.
Yes.
Organics, things that are labeled organic tend to cost more in the first place, so they don't want to be bothered. There are very effective poisons out there for pests and for herbicides as well. If you consider pesticides, include herbicides. But, they're the sort of things that, yeah, they can apply them very easily and you'll have a very effective solution. But I sure don't want them on my lawn. I mean, I worked with diquat and paraquat and stuff like that, and they destroy human lung tissue. I wouldn't let my kids on that lawn. I wouldn't let my pets on that lawn. And, a lot of people are now very concerned, not just about themselves and their family, but they start learning about the bee population going down, the beneficial insect population going down. And, I think neonicotinoids are about to be banned next year. And that's a good thing, because they're probably responsible for a lot of the bee population declining. But there's still a lot of stuff out there that, they like to use on lawns, especially. And people don't realize that control can be had in other ways. It's really an education problem more than anything.
And I mean, in a perfect world, the applicators would help with that education. And I think that's what we're hoping as we move into this. We can work with them, at least some of them, to be.
Yeah, if you can get them to switch to stuff that's more beneficial. But the thing is, you also have to get them to switch to not applying so often or not applying so broadly.
Right.
Like spot treatments. And that's going to be harder.
It is. I mean, this is not a magic wand, no matter what happens. So it's a process.
Mm-hmm. Well,
There's also, did you want to say something? You go ahead.
I think I see the education in a two-tier way, that we're educating the public, who then are the people who inevitably tell the appliers, hey, we don't want this to be used. And I'm sure that the companies that are now supplying these various chemicals will listen to their customers, perhaps more than they will listen to us. But I think that the consumer, once educated, will also apply pressure. Maybe that's the way that this occurs.
It's a good start, and hopefully a majority of consumers, there'll always be some that don't want to be bothered, but if the consumer starts coming back and says, I don't want this product, I want, cover it this way, I want my lawn to be cut higher, that sort of thing, then yeah, it's a good thing, and you'll start to influence the landscapers.
And I also have been saying throughout our process that, I don't think we can outright ban all of everything. It has to be a compromise between the needs of the towns and the needs and wants of the people who live here. So it has to be a compromise. The ordinance will be brought to a vote. So that education will help with that. And I think that we are trying not to make it some draconian, all or nothing kind of an ordinance. I think we realize that this is a democratic process.
Yeah.
I had a question for you and there's been a lot of talk and results in the past couple of years about, say, the lobsters having skin diseases and so on, and the seaweed and other stuff out in the shoreline area being affected by I guess it may be fertilizers and pesticides that are going into the seawater. This isn't just
And
vernal
other
pools,
chemicals.
but are you concerned or talking about protecting the lobsters and the other crustaceans and everything?
Well, I think you have to protect the whole environment. I mean, it's not just lobsters, it's what the lobsters eat and what the organism is that the lobster eats, that organism eats, et cetera, et cetera. I live on the Kennebunk River, and that's a problem right now. It's very polluted. It's very hard to patrol. I mean, you can't even get people to stop zipping up and down the river and making a wake that keeps destroying the banks of the river. It's, eventually you would have nothing but mud there and very shallow water. And I read about the Kennebunk River Alliance and try to read about what's going on. And you've got farms along the way that are, applying stuff, and as well as landscapers for people who live along the shore. And you've got stuff coming down the river, that's polluting. And what you end up with is even if you don't have pesticides in there, you end up with an overly rich coastal area that causes algal blooms, the kind of algae you don't want. I mean, the macroalgae you do because it filters the water, but the other kinds of blooms there, they wreak havoc with the ecosystem out there. And, the marshlands and your waterways and so forth, they feed those coastal areas and the oceans, and it all really works together. And if you overfeed it, you're going to have problems, and you're going to have the kind of pollution that's going to cause problems in lobsters, skin diseases, in fish, skin diseases, and things like that. So you've got to be concerned about that.
What's the model for an ordinance? I mean, what would be a next step that would affect ordinances, enforcement, and how the planning board could comment on property development in marginal areas in a way that we can't now.
Are you referring to the ordinance that we have put out or something different?
Well, I mean, the ordinance that you put out, or what would be the next steps? I mean, how would it go?
I think we're open to discussion as to what would be next steps. Werner, do you want to make a comment on that?
Well, usually whenever you're looking at any kind of ordinance development, and I think you've had some good first steps with, some public survey, right? You get a sense of, where people are at, where public opinion is. Personally, I would look towards a bit more on the technical side of the data gathering, and I think that's part of what this, what you're trying to do with this, the ordinance. You're saying, all right, well, let's find out how much is being applied here in town. So that's a data, that's a data point. I do have some thoughts in terms of, maybe how that gets reported in terms of when you're asking the contractors, where you're applying. The zoning districts might not, I always ask the question, great, now what, right? Now that I've got the data, what do I do with it? What does this tell me? And so, instead of zoning districts, maybe watershed areas might be a better metric in terms of geographic area, because the zoning districts, for something like this are somewhat arbitrary in terms of the borders. The borders follow property boundaries. They don't, some of them follow, natural features, but, the vast majority of them follow a property boundary. And so I always want to know, all right, now that I get the data, what does it tell me and what do I do with it? And I think, the tonnage and the amounts is going to be an interesting piece, but it still doesn't tell me, all right, is this too much? Because I don't have anything to base it off of. It'll help me with a trend, right? It'll tell me, all right, here's what it was in, 2023, and then 2024, and so on and so forth. But what else does it tell me? So tonnage will give you one, that gives you the amount that's going on. I think then the next piece of this is understanding, so what's in the waterways, right? And I think some of that just is going to require a certain level of testing. I mean, I think you need some water testing in order to be able to say, here's what's in the water. And maybe that's something done in conjunction with how we do the water quality testing at Goose Rocks. It's something that maybe after a certain rain event, there's testing. It's not necessarily the same like at Goose Rocks where you've really got to, there's the multitude of tidal issues because you're talking a bit more town-wide. But that's just some of my thoughts in terms of, what are you trying to solve? You're coming at it with the assumption that there's too much, and so, and that it's a detriment, right? Which, we know that, anything in excess is going to lead to problems, right? That's, moderation is key to a lot of things. But you've got to have some of the data, I think, that goes along with that. And I think that's part of what I think, I think those are some of the next steps is kind of some better data gathering, and some better information to be able to say, this is what's going on here.
Has anyone engaged with, through the University of Maine, the Cooperative Extension? There's York County Cooperative Extension.
Soil and Water Conservation District?
Well, that too. Cooperative Extension does a variety of things. And secondly, although a few years ago, the University of Southern Maine amazingly eliminated the Oceanography Department, there is one at UNE.
Right.
They have a Master's of Science in Oceanography as well.
I'm sure you guys are aware of the study that came out for the Kennebunk River, which is what as part of the commission, we're working with the people from Kennebunk and Arundel to do education on that pollution, as Nina mentioned. And, I mean, they got a grant, and they've been doing extensive testing, which I'm pretty sure we're not paying for, right? That the Kennebunk is paying for most of that?
So.
Not that that matters, I just want to make the point
Yeah,
that it is,
no.
it is quite extensive, and it is happening over there.
Yeah, I mean, usually on some of those, the different kind of multi-town watershed testing groups, the communities will pay in a certain amount. In a lot of cases, what that money is used for is to develop and pay for someone to do the grant applications that then actually pay for the study. So
I
usually.
think in this case, Kennebunk is paying for the actual testing at Nelson Labs.
Okay. Yep.
So, and there was a grant written, and that's why they are doing more extensive outreach to the farms and so forth. So that's just in the beginning, but that's a very organized program, actually, because of the grant funding. So we don't have anything like that here, but that might be a good next step for the town to consider for our shoreline in various places. And I'm not as familiar with what's happening at the Little River. But, I mean, I guess my sense about and I'm sorry, is that we know it's too much because we know there's damage, right? There's
Right.
damage to bees, there's damage to so we don't have to worry about what's the right amount, we just need to reduce it in however way we can. That's sort of our position on it. Sorry.
What about Kennebunk Hydroelectric? I don't know if they have any access to any resources. I was on the Mousom yesterday, and there are algal mats forming already in June.
Where are these forming?
On the Mousom River, above the dam.
Oh, above the power dam.
Yep.
Oh,
Well, one reason for that is there's been a lot of opposition to taking out the dams. And people are saying, we have these wonderful ponds, but those ponds are actually not so wonderful.
No.
They're not carbon sinks, they're actually giving off carbon dioxide, and they're very enriched from the land around them. And so you will get a lot of enrichment like that, and you'll get a lot of blue-green algal and green algae mats. As they disintegrate, they smell. And they say, we have wonderful turtles. Well, yes, snapping turtles love that environment. So, I mean, that's a good indication that it's not such a great place, and that letting the river run free, or as my husband puts it, the definition of a river is that it runs, may solve that. And they are going to take out at least the lower dam. If not, are they taking out the second dam too that's further up? I don't know. But the last I heard, they will be taking out the lower dam. That may help to solve that problem. But what it's doing is catching all those chemicals
Oh,
and
yeah, no, I
having
know.
them sit there.
And, well, I'm just wondering, trying to figure out resources. Who else can help with this? If Kennebunk is doing something, does Arundel have any stake in this? Because one of the things with, as you said, a river is it goes through a lot of different communities.
Is it the Nature Conservancy or another group that's been working to basically take out the dams, and they've taken out a lot along other rivers?
They've been involved, that's for
Yeah.
sure.
I'm not sure who it is,
It's,
but there
but
is.
see, it's one of those things where it's a Kennebunk issue. I haven't followed it really closely.
There isn't any, but there are no dams I know of on the Kennebunk River. It's just not that big a river.
Yeah.
And I think, with the pollution coming from farms and properties along the way, I don't know if anybody's dumping. I don't think people dump legally anymore into it. I think the solution is the Kennebunk River Alliance, working with people along there, the shoreland property owners, more than anything else. So,
We've been putting language into findings of fact. Into findings of fact. Is there maybe an ordinance is that if a development is located in shoreland or in some sort of resource protection, that we have set language that we can use in each one of those instances. Same thing for bird strikes, if we wanted to include that. If we had a boilerplate language that we use consistently, because I'm not certain if we go back over the past few years that language has been boilerplate, has been consistent. It might change.
no, it hasn't been consistent, and I think we have the basis on which to formulate some language, and then it would be up to somebody to challenge it if they didn't like it. But I think we could formulate the language and use it.
But that can then go into land use regulation, that if it's in this particular zone, this language has to be adhered to, and we can put it in the findings of fact.
We
Is that
could
a
decide
possibility?
that as a planning board and put that language in there. And it's on the basis of protecting waterways and protecting the environment, protecting bird populations. Like I said, we have the basis to do it. How far we can go, I don't know, because it would take someone challenging us on that language going to court who didn't like it. So far, everybody's agreed. Of course, they may not follow it, but
So in terms of enforcement, so now, I mean, so the difference between that and an ordinance is that the town, it's in the land use language, people verbally agree to it, but there really is no, and they could challenge it if they wanted to make a big deal of it. and if they had
we
deep
would have to
pockets.
write it into the findings of fact.
Okay.
They could verbally agree with it, but they could challenge it afterwards.
Okay.
They could still challenge
how
it
does the
if
town-
Werner tried to enforce it.
And how does the town get involved with enforcement in that case, I guess is my question.
So, I'll give you a general example, of one that, one that came up the other day. So there was there was an application, a project, and, the board had written in, I believe it was a requirement that any pesticide application be done, it was either sparingly or occasionally. And so, property owner said, we noticed and saw that this was in. What does that mean? What is sparingly or occasionally? And so I said, that's a great question. I said, so why don't you tell me what you do now, and let's have a conversation about what that is. Right. So the response was, well, we do we'll do an application for ticks. We do it twice a year. I says, okay. I said, that sounds like occasional to me, twice a year. But that's the metric in which I have to look at something and say, all right, how's that enforced? At this point, they've done their diligence. They recognize that, that this condition was put into place, and they called and asked the question, and that was my response. I said, well, I think that sounds occasional. And given that it is a property that gets a lot of members of the public, and they're concerned with, with health concerns related to tick bites, we both felt that was a reasonable interpretation of that. But you have language that's very subjective sometimes, and that subjective language is very difficult to get definitive about.
That's right. That's right. That's why I always suggested no pesticides, no fertilizer. But, well, I think you could put in language that says fertilizer would only be used once a year and not within so many feet of the shoreland zone. But you need a basis on which, this is where we went the other day in the planning board, you need a basis on which to make that statement, on which you can, if it went to court, you can say, this is what has been shown by data to work,
Yeah, and I can tell you that I think that, having specific language in an ordinance is always going to hold up a lot better than an opinion that's brought forward in a specific, I think in a specific set of findings, or something that
Right.
is, that is based off of a general condition versus something that's a specific condition. Those types of, you have specific regulations that have been voted upon by the town. My tendency is to think that any judge looking at enforcing that says, it's pretty clear, this is what the town intended, as opposed to general or broad language that
Yeah.
is, that is potentially very subjective.
Right.
Sparingly and occasionally.
Sparingly and occasionally.
Sparingly and
right.
occasionally, right. Or, within shoreline, if your whole lot is within the resource protection zone, you don't use fertilizers and you don't use pesticides. We can have specific language along those lines, but it would be good to have a basis, the data, on which to, make that.
Yeah, and and this is where I think you mentioned a little bit about definitions of where definitions are really important, and how and how these things get looked at. And I think I saw it in one of the previous drafts that was circulating. There was I think there was some language that said something similar to fertilizer application within 250 feet. Essentially, it was a discussion on the shoreland zone. Now, so I try to take kind of the path approach. Say, okay, well, what is fertilizer, right? So then I'll follow. All right, what's the definition of fertilizer? Well, under fertilizer, it talks about gave some good definitions, but it also included manure in there. This is great. So what does that tell me? Does that now, in a potential scenario, does that tell me that that animal ag use is not a use now in?
Pretty sure
in a
that's why we
shoreline
took
zone?
it out, because it was just not, you can't tell somebody not to use compost or fertilizer
Right.
in their yard or their garden.
Yeah, well, you have to have a definition there.
But you have to take an ordinance like that, and you have to run it through. You have to run it through those types of scenarios, and you've got to have those types of, robust sort of back and forths of what about this and what about that, and even though sometimes, I mean, that example I just gave you might sound a little bit ridiculous, but whether it's a goat or a cow, applying it, or
Or seaweed. Seaweed
Right.
was used as fertilizer
Yep.
for many years. People would collect it along the coast and use it in the
Well,
fields.
so we're kind of, in this commission, all new to this. We've never done an ordinance before, so I totally agree with you, and we did as much due diligence beforehand by meeting with you and Lori, and also talking to the applicators. What is the process going forward in terms of how we do this robust back and forth on this particular ordinance?
Now, it's a good question. I mean, I think you've got a good basis. You've started the discussion. You have a document. You've gotten, a pretty good, some pretty good feedback from folks, in terms of, the commercial world out there. In terms of process, your next step really is to present the ordinance to the selectmen, and get some feedback from them. I do think that, I'd take it through a legal review. A legal review is going to.
The town does that automatically, correct?
Yeah, at the direction of the selectmen. So if that's something that if that we get direction to say, all right, yep, go ahead and have the town attorney look at this. Then that's something that's something that would occur, and that's where you really start to run something like that a little bit through the ringer. Just in terms of, you get into a little bit more of the nuts and bolts of, is this enforceable? Can you legally do this? Where does your authority come from in the first place to do this? As to whether or not it's successful or not. Because I can tell you, there's nothing worse than putting something out there and then not being able to get anywhere close to, what you want to have happen. I mean, we've seen things where, we've had, ordinance that's been written, and somebody shows up with an application, and boy, it follows the letter of the law, and you look at the project and you say, yeah, that's not quite what we meant. Hence why there's sometimes you see revisions that come back of where you then take it and dial it back in. But I think a legal review is going to be a good step, to flesh out some of these, potential issues that you're going to have. But
Well, and we would also be really interested in hearing any specific suggestions that you folks have to what we have.
I'd like to see it when you've got it
It's
pretty much.
It's It's online.
It is online?
Yeah.
I did
I,
find it
I'll
on-
give you a paper copy on the way out, too.
Okay. Yeah.
Just one thing, the state of Maine does allow for individual towns to have pesticide ordinances. So, we're covered there. And we read a lot of pesticide ordinances from around the state. A lot of us liked Blue Hill. So it's not unprecedented, this activity. And it is, the state does allow towns to decide on this themselves. So that hurdle is, we're over that.
Yeah, that's right. You're not starting fresh.
Right.
No.
Yeah,
Right,
there's
so
plenty
there
of-
is
I
plenty of
just
regs
wish
out
the
there.
state would have a good strict pesticide ordinance for the whole state.
Does the planning office, state planning office, have any sort of guidelines or model ordinances?
Well, the state planning office was broken up a couple of
Right.
administration, in administration.
I
or so
remember the
ago.
administration well.
So
And hopefully you.
a lot of that information, again, just kind of got broken up, and a lot of that is outdated. You now have to kind of go to the different individual, the individual departments. All of those pieces still more or less exist. They just all kind of got spread out.
Okay.
UMaine Cooperative has some good, information, but as to whether or not there is a specific like model ordinance per se, I'm not aware that there's something that is like a good specific model ordinance. That it's not like your subdivision regs, right? Where you start with a model. You start with a model and then you take it and tweak it to your local needs. Type
We
thing.
did have a list, and I can pass that along, of, I think, 29 or 30 towns in the state that have something on the books,
Yeah.
Okay.
many of which are, outright bans.
Good.
So,
That's my feeling about it.
yeah.
I think
That's-
Algonquin's only organic.
Algonquin is one of them,
An outright ban.
an outright ban.
Well, that's one way to
They're
prime
not
the
allowed
pump.
On
to-
synthetics.
they- On
They-
synthetics,
right.
they're not allowed to sell it in any stores in Algonquin, which, is a little bit of a,
Kittery, I
it's
think,
not too far to go out of Algonquin.
Yeah, I'm trying to
if
think
you
where in
wanna buy
Algonquin
it,
you
right?
could buy fertilizer.
Well, I think York and Kittery,
Also.
the Ace, they follow that. Eldridge, they own a fly fishing shop as well as lumber,
Yep.
so I think they're
Yeah.
into water.
Interesting.
But,
Yeah.
yeah, so, it's not impossible, and it's not far there doing that.
Well, it's like prohibition. You
Right.
just go to the next town.
No, we're at, but still,
Or Walmart.
gotta take a
Yeah.
ride anyway.
Oh, you'll always have the exceptions there, people running around, but.
I mean, I
the-
think we're trying, it's a little bit different than something having to do with a building permit or something like that. I mean, we're just really trying to move the needle, and we know that there will be stuff that will slip through, but the more awareness that we have, that people understand that it's not good to use a lot of it, and you can get by with less. I mean, there are a lot of, like, the Kennebunk Conservation Trust has a lovely lawn. They do not use any pesticides or, it's nothing, no weed killer, no nothing. So I think most people think that if you don't use it, you will have a lawn that is just filled and 100% weeds.
No, I had 20 years of a lawn in Westford, Mass. I think I applied an herbicide once broadly to start off the lawn, and then spot treatments for a couple of problems twice. I just let the lawn grow longer,
Yep.
and kept it and overseeded it. It looked better than my neighbors, who was always paying landscapers to come in and spray stuff all over.
Yeah.
So you can have a very lush lawn.
Yeah.
But you have to have the basis to start with. I mean, if you're trying to grow grass on sand, you're going to have a problem.
Well, that brings up something that's Robin suggested a couple of times, which is often when people are building homes, they put down the minimum of topsoil.
They take away the topsoil.
Take away it all, and then they put some of it back. So
Maybe a ban on taking away the topsoil would be a good start.
Yeah, or a requirement for depth. I mean, if you have 8 inches or a foot of loam, don't have many lawn problems.
No.
It's when you have hard pan construction with 2 inches of soil, and then it really depends on the grass seed. There's a, big difference in grass seed. There's a lot that takes no water, doesn't take, and it still looks good. So, again, education would be nice.
And the grass seed is being developed for those situations.
Right.
Scott's is coming out with a GMO grass seed that needs much less fertilizer and less water. I think it'll be a good thing. Of course, the minute you put GMO on it, some people say, oh my God.
And, I think a lot of this is a cultural shift too.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
folks have to, and I think some of those things just take time.
Right.
Where, less and less folks concerned about, the perfect patch, or what is the perfect patch of grass, and lawn, that you have for your outdoor recreational space. And I think that's part of, the struggle that I hear from folks is that, we push folks to be outside, right? We want them to be outside to enjoy the outdoors, and all of those good things. And yet there's also this aversion to, sometimes being outside and dealing with those things.
With nature.
Right, exactly.
I will say that what we heard from the survey, and I think, is going to be even more of a challenge. I think lawns are actually the lowest threshold, no pun intended, because a lot of people didn't seem that concerned about not using chemicals on their lawns. But if you start, people are very concerned about ticks, and people are very concerned about mosquitoes because, if you're getting bitten, you can't really go outside. So that would be the next step in terms of education. And, I think the lawn part will be simpler because
Right.
there are good outcomes.
I'm the worst person for this. We started off with gravel drive 30 years ago, and what we do is just keep mowing it. And it's all weeds, but it looks like a lawn. And I also just finished my 4th bout of Lyme. So, who's the smart one? What if you just went for a full ban? Just try that, throw it out, see what happens.
We threw it out. We saw what happened. It was not fun.
All right.
Maybe we
But-
should promote moss lawns. Then you don't
Yeah.
even have to,
Yeah.
cut them. So, I have plenty of places where the moss is overtaking the grass, and I'm so happy.
No, I think if we thought that could be passed, we would have gone for it. But,
Okay.
Yeah.
dispassionately looking at the survey results and knowing that incremental change is usually the most effective, we decided to try for this.
I'm hard pressed to think of anyone in Kennebunkport who sells fertilizer, pesticides, or herbicides. It's kind of like a gunkwit. Used to be the hardware store over to Cape Porpoise, but that's
Right,
gone.
and, closest would be Port Hardware.
Yeah.
They call that Kennebunkport.
Yeah.
We don't have
Well,
them.
It's not, though.
there aren't many places to buy stuff like that in Kennebunkport, period.
Well, that's what I mean. There isn't a
There are no
place.
stores.
Or you buy gas in Kennebunkport.
That's it.
Yeah.
No place.
It's next to the stoplight.
So I think, I don't know about you guys, but I think we've had a pretty good discussion here, and we definitely want to see, get a reference to your website. Maybe you can give it to April, and she can
Yep.
give it to all of us. And,
Sure. It's great if you
no,
go
we're
to-
happy to pass any of that info along.
The
But I think
Falmouth
this was
stuff, you're gonna
a
send that?
very
Yeah, I'll send
productive
that.
meeting.
I was dying to hear Larry's opinion.
I'll send you the Falmouth report and a copy of the ordinance. I think actually it's just on the agenda of our last meeting. So we probably need to get it.
If you just send it to Tom, he'll get it out to
I'll
all
get
of
it
us.
Okay.
What about MOFGA? The Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association.
I reached out several times, got nothing.
Nothing. Everybody's,
We refer to their website in the ordinance.
okay.
They did have a symposium or something a year or so ago on organic lawns and lawn care, so, but when I tried to, we were gonna have some speakers, but, that never materialized, and, I tried to get one of them. I think Steve was gonna get the Board of Pesticides from Maine, right?
Yeah.
Megan.
What
But-
about Shelley Pingree's office? She was one of the original board members of MOFGA
She
many
was?
years ago. Oh, God, yes. One of them hippies out to the islands.
Is there anyone in any of the main universities, colleges that's working on grasses? Because sometimes you can get those people to come and speak.
I think maybe some of the shore grasses
There absolutely is, at least used to be, because my lab at Orono was right next. I went through several years of listening to turf grass management classes. They were held in the classroom next door. I don't remember any of it, but I heard it.
And often you can get those people to speak. They're more reliable than, groups.
They were big on
and stuff.
pesticides and herbicides all the time.
Well,
I bet.
Well, they all are, and,
This was a while ago.
I was
I-
at Purdue, and it's a big weed science group
Oh,
and
yeah.
everything. But there was a guy who worked mostly on grasses for golf courses and stuff.
well,
turf
you
grasses.
probably know the people better than I, but the people that I know that do like the pesticide drift and that sort of thing, which is my field, I find that the universities they're mostly funded by the pesticide
By
companies.
Yes.
So you say, oh, Joe Blow will be great, he's at University of whatever, and it turns out all of his grants are from Monsanto or somebody.
Yeah, I know. I worked on grants from Eli Lilly as well as the feds. So, like I said, that's where our grant money came from. That doesn't mean that we didn't work on things that were not pesticide related and everything. And anyone that works on turf grass is going to know a lot of the basics. So of growing those grasses with or without pesticides. So.
Just a quick question. What's the engagement been like with the golf course? Have they been involved in any of the discussions with you all? Cape
We have
Arundel?
not the Arundel Golf Course. We've had the gentleman who runs the Abenaki Golf Course over in Biddeford Pool has been a fan, or not, but he's been very.
He is a
active.
resident of Kennebunkport.
He's a resident of Kennebunkport.
Okay,
So the answer is no.
okay, all right.
Well,
In
I know
fact,
Brendan pretty well, since we're neighbors, basically. He's always out on the golf course, so. Yeah. No, not the Secret Service, Brendan.
Well, I think unless somebody objects, we might as well adjourn, but thank you for everybody for coming and getting this together. And so I think we're out of here.